Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well and healthy. I would like to thank everyone from anywhere you're listening to the podcast. In today's episode, we're going to speak about inclusive robotics community. Have you ever asked yourself, what does inclusion mean to you? Actually, I tried to answer this question, but I found it hard to answer. We're going to talk about what is the meaning of being inclusive robotics community and how we can achieve it. You and your ideas must be heard, and you must feel belong inside university or even the lab. I would like to stress it doesn't matter what is your skin color, beliefs, ethnicity. What only matters how you are a good human being who cares about others. I would like to thank my co-host for today's episode, Torrie Edwards, for her dedication at RSS Inclusion Program, where I'm co-chairing with her, and hope we can come up with a meaningful program for marginalized and underrepresented students at robotics. And also special thanks to Professor Hadas for being a strong advocate for inclusion program at robotics community. I hope you would find this episode useful for many of you. And also I would like to say I hope everyone is doing well and healthy during this time. And thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to IEEE Soft Robotics podcast. Today I would like to introduce my co-host Torrie, and it's a pleasure to have you in the podcast. Could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Torrie Edwards. I am a roboticist, excited to be here with Marwa today, talking with Professor Hadas Kress-Gazit.
Great.
So, everyone, I'm Hadas Kress-Gazit. I'm an associate professor of mechanical and aerospace engineering at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. I've been in Cornell since 2009. My research is on high-level verifiable robotics, providing guarantees for robot behaviors and thinking about specifications and verification and synthesis in the context of robotics and physical systems. I've worked with, my group has worked with modular robots, multi-robot systems, humanoids, mobile robots, soft robots. We're kind of collaborating with Rob Shepard. And yeah, that's it.
Great. Hi, thank you so much for joining us today. Both Marwa and Hadas, I would love to hear more about what you think diversity inclusion is, and maybe even more so how you found yourself involved in these areas.
That's a big question. So it's really, we're researchers in engineering and robotics and in all aspects of these engineered systems. And to really make good systems, you need a lot of perspectives, and you need a lot of ability to listen and to interact and to, there's a lot of research out there to show that people make better systems when there's a lot of perspectives within the room. And those perspectives come a lot of times from different experience, from different identities, from different, just life, right? And if everybody looks the same and has the same background and is interested in the same topics, then we don't explore really what we can do. So the way I'm thinking about diversity and inclusion, it's bringing in all these perspectives and making sure that all these perspectives are welcome and supported and listened to. And historically, there have been specific groups that have been underrepresented in engineering and STEM more broadly, and in robotics in general, or robotics more specifically. And we need to do whatever we can to increase the representation. So, people may or may not notice from my voice, I'm a woman. I'm a white woman, so I belong to a group that is underrepresented typically in engineering, and I belong to a group that is overrepresented, probably not overrepresented, but is not a minority. And that lets me bring different perspective to my work and to my research and to my mentorship and to everything that I do. And we need to make sure that all those things are represented.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. So I would like to ask you, when you start inclusion program at RSS conference, how was the beginning? It was easy for you, and when you realistically speaking, when you look at the communities of robotics, do you think this problem is already touched in a deep way, and there is enough awareness of this issue?
So let me so you asked a few things. So let me first start with the more specific. I was the program chair for Robotics Science Systems 2018. There I started two initiatives that happened also in 2019. And as you guys know, Marwa and Torrie are leading one of those initiatives in 2020. Those were pioneers, which is intended for kind of senior PhD students, postdocs, and so on as a networking event. And then there's inclusion at RSS, which the intent was to bring in young researchers, so undergraduates towards the end, very early career graduate students, so first, second year graduate students, and bring them into the conference and provide some mentorship structure with the pioneers. And those students were chosen based on how they increase representation in robotics. Mm-hmm. So we prioritized people who have never been to a conference. We prioritized people who have never been to RSS. Actually, I think none of them have been to a robotics conference before when we created this initiative. And we supported a little over 20 students each year to kind of a travel grant and some mentorship activities throughout the conference. And it was very well received by the students who participated. Mm-hmm. I'm a very strong believer that the way to increase representation is allow access, and part of it is funding. So paying for people, typically undergraduates or first or second year students who don't have papers don't go to conferences. So making it easier for them to come to conferences, to understand what the expectations are, to network, to meet other researchers, to meet more senior researchers. Those are things that I think will make an impact. We've done it, done it for 2 years, so it's kind of hard to tell long term what that impact was. But it's, and I have to also mention that the Women in Robotics workshop that you guys were obviously involved in did a great job in also bringing in a lot of women, especially at the PhD level, and that was noticeable in terms of the change in demographics of the conference. Yeah. The other part of your question was, is there enough awareness? I think that was the question.
Yeah.
So I think it's mixed. I think there is definitely more awareness than there was even 10 years ago. I think a lot of the conversation tends to revolve around gender, which is not the full picture. When we talk about international conferences, it's a little more difficult to identify underrepresented minorities. So I'm in the US. In the US, there's a very clear definition. So that's a little bit easier to talk about. But I think a lot of times people equate diversity and inclusion with gender diversity. And that is definitely part of it. I mean, women are over 50% of the population, but that is by no means the only demographic we need to look at. We need to look at racial minorities. We need to look at people with disabilities. We need to look at LGBTQ to make sure that they're welcome and supported and comfortable at our conferences. We need to make sure, students who are first generation, for example, typically have more hurdles on their path to graduate research and to becoming researchers in the community. So those are other demographics that I think are some places do a really good job with it, and some places I would argue the discussion is still revolving around gender.
Mm-hmm. The question you just, or the statements you were just making, I'm wondering how sometimes discussions about inclusion, and Marwa and I have certainly found this in our own personal experiences, but also seen examples of it in other podcasts and other sources, that people who hear inclusion turn their ears off. They think they say that's not for them. They hear that there's a women breakfast at ICRA, and so they shouldn't attend, or that it's a inclusion and they're a white man and so they shouldn't be participating. Do you have any insights or ideas about what starts making the conversation more universal? Because I think in a lot of ways, some of the problems that we're seeing, especially among young researchers, while the minorities experience them more heavily, are also experienced in ways by the majority as well. So imposter syndrome is a big one discussed right now at the undergraduate level. I would be curious to know if you had thoughts on what makes a more inviting and I want to say inclusive, but not maybe inclusive in terms of the minority, but inclusive in terms of the discussion. How do we bridge the gap? Because we're not going to see inclusion met unless both sides want to meet it 50-50. Like the minority can't join the majority unless the majority wants to take part in that conversation.
Yeah. So you bring up a bunch of different points that I think are super important. One of them is being an ally, right? So, and one of them is being an ally, right? Making sure that you support underrepresented group from a place of not being the white savior here to tell you what to do and help you do this because we know better, but rather opening the space for listening and to make changes that are not coming from what you think or from me as a majority and along some dimensions think should happen, as opposed to listening and making sure the environment is such that those voices are heard and appreciated and respected. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect is, I think what you're saying is that a lot of things that have to do with inclusion are actually makes everybody's life better, right? So thinking about ensuring that a research climate is supportive for everyone, not just minorities, not just the underrepresented groups. So there's a lot of benefit in thinking about ideas that enable inclusion beyond the demographics of the people who are supported. But because, as imposter syndrome is an excellent point, right? So people who don't know what it is, it's this kind of nagging feeling that you're not as good as people think you are, and it's going to show up soon, right? And all of us, to some extent, suffer from this, or most of us. Let's put it that way. Then there's the inclusion. Oh, the word inclusion. Yes. So I think I've noticed the change in phrasing. And I should actually, let me just stop for a second and kind of a full disclosure. I am not an expert in gender studies or methods for increasing diversity or inclusion, or there are people who study that and they're amazing and we need to listen to them and to think about best practices. But I think I have a perspective from being a woman in engineering, but also being a white woman in engineering. So that I'm kind of coming from that perspective. So let me just kind of be very clear about that. So the word, I've noticed that there's been a change in going from the word diversity to the word inclusion, which is still, Torrie, you're absolutely right, still creates kind of this knee-jerk reaction by some people that is just, we've done so much, what do they want from us anymore? This is just a social justice thing, which, social justice is important, but this is not what we're talking about right now. What we're talking about right now is making sure that research is done in the most optimal way. And once people realize the whole notion of making sure that our research community is inclusive, it benefits everybody. It benefits the research. So it's not quotas. It's not, you must have 30% of this group in your group. That is not the intent. The intent is identifying talent of all flavors and making sure they're nurtured and listened to and able to grow and support this research endeavor of robotics and more general STEM. So I don't how to get rid of the bad rep that the word diversity and the word inclusion get. I honestly don't know. But other than again and again and again explaining that inclusion is not a matter of this kind of kumbaya feeling of everybody needs to support. It is a way to make this environment and this research enterprise better along multiple dimensions. So How to get, what is the right word to use for that, I'm not quite sure. But it's a matter of having these conversations and have these conversations around the benefits of inclusion and to everyone, as opposed to the negative aspects of kind of a toxic climate and discrimination and harassment and all these things, which of course are a part of it, but kind of talking about it more from the how do we make everybody's life happier, especially these times, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. So I'm curious to ask you, because we have diversity in academic world, for example, and robotics as well, but maybe there's difference about how to reach or the gap from diversity and be inclusive. So maybe other students can relate to that maybe you are not included enough in your lab or in the university, and I think that's issue here. It's more than I think it's more deeper as we think about how this issue is complicated. So as a rule of RSS conference, how do you think that this something can also transfer to universities or lab? How we can ensure this happen? Is it maybe boiled down to education or outreaching enough? And how do you think this kind of issues can be also tackled inside universities or labs?
So interesting that you bring this up. I don't know, Torrie, you weren't there at the NRIPI meeting, right? I don't think you were.
No, I was not.
Yeah, so there was an NRIPI meeting, and Chad Jenkins, who is wonderful, organized a panel kind of on this notion of inclusion, and I was one of the panelists. And we got kind of the same question, right? So how do you, I think it was more in the context of faculty, of how to retain underrepresented faculty. And it comes back to the same things, right? So make sure you listen to people, make sure you give them space to express their opinions, listen to what they say, make changes based on what they need. And I don't know if as importantly, but definitely kind of up there, is make sure you deal with people who don't behave correctly, who don't behave in a way that's supportive and inclusive. Mm-hmm. So if you kind of brush away bad behavior and basically say, oh, but that's just the way that person is. I'm sure you've heard this before, right? So this person made a terrible comment. Oh yeah, that's just the way that person is. Well, you know what? That should not be acceptable anymore. Things that were accepted 50 years ago are no longer okay along many different types of behaviors. And what universities need to do is, put their foot down on bad actors as well. And the reason I bring up the NRIPI panel is because I made kind of a similar statement there that got some pushback, and I was surprised that it got the pushback, but it did. So yes, making sure that everybody is held to a high standard is very important to make sure that climate is supportive. Otherwise, you can do all these summer outreach programs and all the recruitment initiatives and all that, but if you come into an environment in which people who behave poorly are tolerated or even celebrated, then you didn't do anything, in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Do you think we need a mechanism for that in university to change it? Because I think that what we said about a podcast is also a comment about diversity and inclusion. Maybe is like image in the university, and that's why do you think what kind of regulation or mechanism should be changing? Do you have any idea about that?
Well, I think that I can talk about the U.S., right? So I'm in a university in the U.S. We have the mechanisms. It's just a matter of it's hard to go against people who are well respected for their research. Even though they have terrible climate in their research groups. So I think the mechanisms are in place. It's a matter of being diligent about enforcing them. And I'm not talking about, blatant kind of, sexual harassment or terribly racist comments and stuff like that. We've been talking about kind of environments that are not conducive for research and having we do have a lot of training. I can tell you that in the US we do have, or I can tell you about Cornell, let me be a little more specific. We do have a lot of training in terms of if you choose to do them, in terms of mentorship and climate, and in terms of appropriate conduct and all that. But sometimes, it's not a specific incident that can get someone fired, but it's a matter of everybody in the community basically saying, you know what you're doing now is not okay. You're acting like a bully. You're acting like, and it's hard. It's really hard to do this with your colleagues, right? So sometimes the behavior that others report is not the behavior that you see, because there's a different power differential. So people will behave differently towards their peers as opposed to people that they supervise, right? There's this very clear power differential in academia between faculty and students, even between TAs and graduate students and undergraduate students. And even if the behavior is not something that's violates a law, there are things that can cause damage in terms of an inclusive environment that should be called out. And it's hard. It's really hard. I mean, I'm definitely, I definitely should have spoken up in a few times that I did not, right? Because sometimes it takes you even a while to realize that something happened that you should have spoken up about. And that's fine. So, right? So it's not, it's just a matter of the more we expect an environment that is supportive and inclusive, the more it will happen. So, but it's hard. I mean, it's really hard. It's changing, but things are changing, right? I can see even if I look at some of the conferences I go to, some of the program reviews I go to, some of them are still, looking at the audience, it's very clear that, I don't know if very clear, but it looks very homogeneous, which is disappointing sometimes. But things are changing, and I'm hopeful.
I think an interesting idea that Marwa and I were introduced to recently, actually also by Professor Chad Jenkins, was this idea of intellectually inclusive. And I think that kind of builds off what you were just talking about how you're interacting with your colleagues and the difficulties it can be from the student to the professor to the senior professor, and how those interactions happen. How do you see intellectual inclusivity at your own university, out in the community? How do you see those also playing a role maybe in some of this idea about inclusion meaning support and under all types, like an encompassing umbrella?
Yeah, I've had this conversation with Chad, and I 100% agree with what he says. I think he says that there are some trends in robotics that get hyped up. Well, I don't know if hyped up, but get a lot more attention, and they're exciting trends. But then getting something published that looks different is difficult, because people are expecting a certain type of paper, and I 100% agree with that. I think one of the best examples I can give of that is actually RSS, right? So I think very highly of RSS. I'm very committed to that organization, but it's really hard to get systems papers through Robotics Science and Systems review process, and that's because they're different. They're a little bit different. There's not one technical contribution typically that says, okay, this is the new technical thing, but rather there's the system science, and it's hard to review those papers, right? And those papers kind of sometimes struggle. So that kind of the need to look broader and to kind of figure out, okay, this is an interesting contribution to research, to our understanding of what robotics is. That is something that that needs to be emphasized a little bit more. And I think if you're used to a specific type of paper, for example, it's hard to see how other papers make contributions, even though they do. So I think I think, I mean, not to speak for Chad, obviously, but those are the things kind of I've got from conversations with him, and I 100% agree with that. So, it's a matter of whenever, here's a concrete thing, right? Whenever you're reviewing a paper, and this is not me, this is pretty much everybody who's ever been a program chair in anything would say, or an area chair or associate editor, is whenever you see a new paper, think about kind of, does it teach you something new? Is it something you didn't think about before? Is it something new, even if there's no one new algorithm that has this much improvement over the other algorithm? So yes, intellectual diversity is definitely connected into this inclusion idea. So I spoke a lot about kind of more identity, diversity and identity, but that also influences your experiences, your interests, also influence the intellectual directions you take, and we need to be better in looking at the contribution, even if it's not quite in the format you're used to, or the kind of the way you're used to thinking about the world. So yeah, 100% that's part of this. It's harder it's harder a little bit to articulate exactly the differences there. So
Yeah. I think it's also interesting because, for example, there is a report about robotics design for queer population, population, sorry, and also for example the bias we have in AI algorithms. So I think that's kind of maybe correlated to intellectual inclusiveness.
mm-hmm.
So I'm curious to ask you when you expect we can reach level of being inclusive. If you look to how many years you would expect that we have a community that everyone is heard and speak up for something just you are not convinced about, whether scientifically or in your work, ethics, anything. When you expect this could happen?
I have no idea. I really have no idea. It's I mean, we don't have that in society in general, right? So this is not something that's we don't live in a society that is accepting of everybody. Far from it. Hopefully the robotics community will do better than the general society, but I think it's important, it's important to have these conversations and increase awareness, and things are getting better. I don't even know how to define to be fully inclusive, right? It's a hard question. I don't know, but I am hopeful that things are getting better. There's definitely a lot more support from funding agencies and interest from funding agencies. Again, this is very US centric.
Mm-hmm.
My perspective is very US centric, which makes me happy. not the perspective, but rather the fact that there's funding agencies are putting a lot of emphasis on this, on showing that you are actually reaching. There's the whole notion of broadening participation, which is part of it, and a lot of conversations around PI conduct, which is also becoming more and more apparent these days. So things are getting better. When we're going to be fully inclusive, I have no idea. I don't know if that's even possible.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And if I ask you about the progress, Jay, how do you see the progress so far in since you started RSS inclusion? How do you see the progress?
Yeah, I don't know if I can see, not since, I mean, it's been 2 years, so really it's not, I don't see, it's not so much that I see progress from that. I just see a lot more discussion, a lot more awareness, both at kind of, if I think about universities, at the administration level, there's a lot of kind of really cool organizations that are supporting a lot of participation of a lot of people. So the Women in Robotics workshop that you guys organized. And then there's, different in large AI conferences, there's a lot of initiatives like Black in AI and Women in ML, and there's a bunch of different initiatives that are just increasing representation by actually helping people show up, right? Because the more I'm a huge believer in critical mass. So the more people you'll see that are like you, the more you can see yourself doing this thing, the more diversity, the richer the environment becomes. So
mm-hmm. Yeah,
No, so I'm very hopeful that inclusion at RSS will have that impact at some point. But I don't know that we're definitely not there yet. It's a process. I think my hope for and you guys, I mean, you did both. For people who don't know, both Torrie and Marwa are co-chairing the Inclusion at RSS 2020, which is going to be a little bit different this year because we're going virtual. So it's going to be. We'll see. We should talk about that.
I'm interested in changing the direction slightly, and I'm curious in knowing more about your, I don't know, hopes and dreams for robots seems very cliche, but maybe things that you're really excited about in robotics right now, or even ideas that you're could see being really game changers to where maybe your researcher is going or other areas of research in the field.
I'm super excited about the notion of, I mean, this is something I've been doing for a while now, so, maybe super excited. It's not necessarily something new, but we're getting more and more capable. So robots becoming, as you know, more and more capable, especially with the new perception algorithms that are based on deep learning and new hardware platforms that are affordable, and soft robots and modular robots, and just so many advances in the last few years. And the question that I always kind of guide my research is, what can we say about these systems? What kind of guarantees can we provide? How should we even talk about specifications? What should these systems do? Right? How do I talk about what a high-level specification is beyond writing the code? Right? How do I go from a description of what I want the robot to do to automatically generating code that has some guarantees, or controllers that have some guarantees? So those are things I kind of think about. And recently we've been thinking about in collaboration with a few colleagues on what does it mean also for HRI. So the notion of formal specifications for HRI, what does that look like? So Kirsten Eder, Guy Hoffman, and Rashid Alami and me organized a DAX tool last year. So that was a really exciting DAX tool. People who don't know what that is, it's a bioimitation only seminar in Germany, and in a specific place in Germany that you can propose workshops, and if they accept it, then it's a week-long seminar that basically you run, right? So the way we ran it was mainly discussions and kind of breakout groups, so very few talks, and just so many new ideas came out of that, so I'm super excited about that.
Mm-hmm.
That, and also kind of robots that have, modular robots, swarm robots, soft robots, things that are maybe less different from the traditional differential drive mobile robot. So,
yeah. What could be the misconception you witnessed when you work in the field? Misconceptions, or something was concerning to you?
Misconceptions. I think people, not roboticists, people who are outside of robotics, think robots can do a lot more than they can actually do, or have, or trust. I don't know if trust is the right word, but perceive them as being a lot more capable than they actually are. So that's interesting, right? So, and I'm definitely not the only one who observed this. There's a lot of people who have written, wonderful think pieces and op-eds and stuff like that on what the difference between what robots can actually do and what people think because of sci-fi and all that. So
Mm-hmm.
I think they assume more than we can actually do, but then hence the whole AI will kill us, robots will kill us conversations.
Yeah. So I would like to go back to the point of funding, because I think that's a very interesting point about funding for the project. Do you think, firstly, when we have a project in academia for robotics, for example, it should be project-driven or technology-driven? And also, when you highlight it's inclusive as well, to be inclusive in your research, whether intellectually or with the people you work with, how you would see this could improve the common decade of robotics, for example, if we deploy these concepts for funding, for example?
I think there's definitely, we can see in funding trends, there's a lot more emphasis on multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, whatever version of something disciplinary you want to think about. And those kind of, by definition, require intellectual diversity, because you want to cross disciplines and people think differently. So I've noticed in some of my interdisciplinary projects that there's a significant amount of time at the beginning just establishing kind of a common vocabulary. When I say this, what do I mean? Right? When I say model, what do I mean? When I say specification, what do I mean? So I think a lot of the kind of the larger opportunities now in funding would require intellectual diversity, just kind of by the way they're structured. And the fact that they're in the US anyway, and specifically NSF, the National Science Foundation, requires in the large projects to have a very concrete broadening participation and broader impact plan. And they've always had a broader impact, but now they're putting a lot more emphasis on broadening participation. I think that will have really great impact in the future. So, sitting on panels, I've seen people, panelists and program managers take that seriously, right? If you write a nice research proposal and your broadening participation plan is terrible, it will affect kind of how likely you are to get funded. So it's not that it's people typically don't do well. A lot of people are not just putting boilerplate in to get rid of that requirement. People are really thinking creatively about how to do these to make sure to broaden participation in computing or in STEM. So that's really exciting to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was kind of wondering just to get your perspective on inclusion in RSS. So you are involved in the Women in Robotics workshop that was kind of a separate workshop that was kind of co-organized with RSS. And then now we kind of institutionalized that through inclusion at RSS, and you've taken you've taken leadership in that, and which I'm so thankful to you guys for that. What is your perspective?
So for me, when we first talked about transitioning from the Women in Robotics workshop to inclusion, a conversation that stood out with me. So I guess for some context, I started participating at RSS in 2017. I was a participant at the Women in Robotics workshop. My experience at RSS was interesting. There were some really great things and there were some not so great things. I then decided to help organize the 2018 workshop and then took a step back for the 2019 workshop. But I've attended RSS every year and have been incredibly fortunate to do so. And what I found every time I went is that more and more women that I was seeing were coming up to me and saying, Torrie, can you believe it? I wasn't the only girl in my circle of people that I was talking to at coffee break. And especially there were like senior women who had graduated from the program, were now professors in the field, were telling me about their experiences as early participants in the 2014 Women in Robotics workshops, and were saying they could remember, even in the short 5 years, a time when 15 of them were the only women students participating in the conference. And so I really felt that the Women in Robotics workshop had come to a point of critical mass where we were at a point of 40 to 50 plus applicants. The organization of that was becoming more and more logistically challenging in terms of getting funding to students and how do we incorporate some of those harder questions. And it really meant that transitioning to an inclusion at RSS, where we're not just considering the needs of gender, as Hadas and Marwa have both brought up, but also the broader needs of inclusion in terms of intellectual, of different underrepresented minorities, whether that be LGBTQ, race, ethnicity, and those can be different based on the regions that you come from, and maybe less well defined than in the United States. Those minorities tend to be really, really well defined. But I think that opportunity to then take inclusion in RSS and try to combine some of the things that we found worked really well at Women in Robotics has been an incredibly exciting prospect. Marwa and I have spent a lot of time really trying to assess, what does it mean to be inclusive? How do we make sure, as Hadas has pointed out, that that participants are able to see voices that reflect them? So that it ends, how do we make sure that people who are participating don't feel like they're just participating because they check some box? Because unfortunately, people can be left to feel like tokens if they're being invited to participate in either a student or other type of panelist or mentor role, where they're feeling they're only being asked because of their XYZ diversity category. And I think those conversations that Marwa and I have greatly appreciated, and also see a really positive light, as Hadas has been saying, about where we can go in the future in terms of how do we start bridging the gaps in the conversation so that we can reach the broader RSS community, but also continue to create space for students who are coming into this community with exciting and passionate ideas about how we can move robotics forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I want to go back to what Torrie said at some point at the beginning, the fact that sometimes people are self-conscious about attending events that are kind of labeled inclusion or all those, and those are having people from majority groups is actually very powerful, because especially if they come and listen and they show support by not trying to take over the conversation or saying that they know what the answer is, rather listening to even if there is no solution currently, but even listening to the problems and listening to kind of what the perspective of other people, that is very powerful, and can learn a lot from that. So
Yeah. But do you think that if we ask you about this question, how we can do this kind of activities in the lab for reinforcing the inclusions? How you think about this in the lab? Can we engage or encourage a student to work in that and be aware more about inclusion?
Well, there are a few things, right? So there is the personal example that you set. So a personal example that you set by treating people with respect, by listening to voices, by creating an environment in which people feel safe to talk. That's kind of the first, I think, step. Encourage different activities that are around inclusion, I think, is also powerful, right? So talking about, what is included in RSS, just as an example. We're talking about encouraging people to reflect on kind of what's around them, right? So I don't have there's no recipe, right? There's no, you must do A, B, and C, and then you're inclusive. You must not do, well, yes, there are some things you must not do, but that's a different conversation. Yeah, I don't know, it's there are people who do really well. So I'm definitely going to shout out Radhika Nagpal, who's a professor at Harvard. She thinks a lot about this, and she has she gave a talk at she gave a talk at actually at the RSS Women in Robotics workshop at MIT. When was it? 2018, 2017. Torrie, we were there then. Did you listen to Radhika's talk?
Yes, I actually was fortunate to be able to have an email correspondence with her afterwards, because I left the main conference feeling very much like I didn't belong to the robotics community, and that I really shouldn't be in it. And I was at the whole Women in Robotics workshop, and at the end when Radhika talked, it really very much inspired me that there was hope. And I don't know, hope might be an exaggeration, but it was a shining light that caring about equality in other people and the success of everyone around you, that it wasn't just going to be a dog-eat-dog competition for the rest of my PhD.
Yeah. So she came and gave it the same talk, a similar talk at Cornell. It was awesome. So it is recorded. I can find the link. So she thinks a lot about inclusion, and she has some really nice practices in her group, which I don't know if she ever wrote about it specifically, but it's that talk was very inspiring to me as well. I remember it was interesting because she gave the talk at the Women in Robotics workshop, and it was I think it was, I don't know if I remember it was only women in the audience, but it was probably not only, but very few men, and it was very emotional. There's it was a very good talk, and then she kind of she actually has it also. I think the transcript is somewhere now online, but she's a person that I like to talk to a lot in general, just because she's awesome, but also she has she's very insightful and thinks about these things, about notions of equity and inclusion in very, very interesting ways.
Yeah. So if I ask you about the challenges you have, whether on a professional level as well as your mission about inclusion, and what are the challenges you have?
Well, right now I'm working from home in my son's bedroom, so that's a challenge. So I'm guessing it's a challenge that all of us are dealing now with the whole coronavirus thing.
I think it's interesting. She says corona, but I think, how do you see the robotics strategies for this kind of pandemic? I think there is a lot of hope here for robotics field. How you would imagine that?
Yeah, there are definitely some really cool op-eds out there about robotics in coronavirus time, and supporting hospitals, supporting delivery, all these things. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see kind of what comes out of this. What are the lessons that we learned from this kind of self-isolation and ability of robotics to help with that? So that's going to be really cool to figure out in the next few years.
Yeah.
In terms of other challenges, I think for inclusion, I don't find, well, I have not run into challenges in terms of starting initiatives or running programs. People have been extremely supportive in general, and when they do, and when some of the ideas are not great, provide really, really great feedback. I think some challenges are maybe on the, I actually don't know what to say there. So yeah, let's remove that.
So maybe would we ask you how you would see inclusion in 1 decade, for example? How you imagine this could happen, like organization or something could help people and make sure that anyone affected or just be heard, and how you would see the end goal when you started this first since 3 years ago more, how you envision this in 10 years coming when you start this kind of activities. What do you think about it after 10 years?
Well, after 10 years, I kind of hope we don't need it. So, I mean, the whole point of these things, and this is kind of what we did with I was involved in one of the women robotics organizations for 1 year, I think 1 year. The whole point of these kind of initiatives is to make them obsolete, to make them not needed anymore, because it's no longer a notion of underrepresentation, right? So as Torrie was saying, we kind of decided to wrap women robotics with inclusion by putting more of the emphasis on inclusion as opposed to gender, because we've seen better representation in terms of gender at RSS. So I really hope these initiatives are so successful that we don't need them, that they kind of, I don't think it's going to happen in 10 years, but I want to go into a conference and just literally see a lot of different representation, and both in the technical content that I see, and in the demographics that I see, and in even the things that, here's one thing that came up at RSS 2018, which again, this is my blind side, right? So I'm able-bodied. I have no physical disabilities, and we had one of the authors. Ask for help with closed captioning because the person is hard of hearing. And it's something that never occurred to me, right? Never occurred to me to have closed captioning in a conference. And then when someone actually brings it up to you and you're just like, why did we not think about this before? Because it's so obvious, right? It's obvious. It doesn't affect me personally, so it never occurred to me. But once someone brings it up, it is so obvious that it's such a good idea. And then we did that for 2018 and 2019 as well. And it turns out that it helps a lot of people, for example, people whose native language is not English. It helped them kind of keep track a little bit more of what's going on. And it's just like things like that things like that. I guess I'm coming back not so much to where we are in 10 years, but rather what inclusion can help with, and can help with more than the people it's trying to target. That was such a good example of something that affected someone specific, and then helping basically a lot of other people, just because we did something that was fairly simple. We had someone that was closed captioning the event. So those kinds of things, of people feeling comfortable coming and saying, okay, this would help, this would make the experience better. Those are things that I'm really happy about. That had nothing to do with inclusion at RSS, by the way, but it was just a matter of someone contacting us and just bringing up a great idea.
Yeah, I think thanks to Torrie, because I think Torrie can tell about that, because she identified one of applicant is in a need for is already American Sign Language. So if Torrie can tell more about that, because she made a lot of effort in that.
We've been researching, because our inclusion at RSS this year is going to be virtual. We've been researching lots of ways for how to make sure we can communicate with everyone as best we can across time zones, and also meet the needs of applicants who their first language may be American Sign Language. And so there are different best practices. So fortunately, teleworking has been a thing in the United States for a long time. So there are some really great resources out there for people who are able-bodied to interact better with people who may have some type of hearing or visual impairment that would allow that over a teleconference. And so closed captioning is something that's been suggested. There are a few other means that we're also looking into to try and make sure that we are as inclusive of an inclusive participation event as we can be.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing, and well, not amazing. I mean, it's once those technologies exist, it's a matter of realizing that you need it, right? And then it helps it helps everybody.
Yes.
There's really no downside to that.
Yes, and so I think it really is, for me at least, it's identifying where my privileges are. I, like you had asked, I'm able-bodied, and some of those things just didn't occur to me until I saw it, and I was like, oh, I have privilege there, and I need to dissect what that means for me, but also how to make sure we are building spaces that are able to hear what those people, what other people may need, and listen to their concerns and really address them meaningfully.
I think it's very interesting, because given the situation of virtual conference, this kind of needs is not really considered as we see other experiences. And that's something I think we have to stress on in this point. So I would like to ask you about in that if we have robotics that can, for example, giving a services or help you and doesn't really judge you by your how you looks like or what is your color or example like that. Do you think we have robotics would be inclusive and not have any biases?
No, I don't think that's going to happen, because the robots are designed by people, and will have biases, and it's ingrained, right? A couple of months ago, I remember seeing it on Twitter, and I don't remember the person, but I could look that up. There was a discussion around delivery robots that drive on sidewalks, and the fact that when they drive on the sidewalk and when they go into the road, they go on where the curb is low, so it kind of can drive down to the road. And then someone in a wheelchair basically said, "Well, that robot saw me, and it stopped because it didn't, because I'm guessing the collision avoidance algorithms, whatever, made it stop. And then the person couldn't get on, basically got stuck in the road because the delivery robot was blocking their way."
Wow.
And that's something that I don't know this for a fact, but I would imagine that if there was someone in a wheelchair working for that company, it's less likely that would have happened, because they would have said, you know what, this is the robot is about the width of this place where you can get off the sidewalk easily to the road, and if it stops, it's basically blocking the wheelchair from getting up. Wow. So I thought that was very, that's a bias.
Yeah.
It's an able body.
Yeah.
That, I wouldn't have thought about it. Why would I think about it, right? It's that's why I need someone else to come in and be part of the design team to help me think about things I didn't think about, because that's not my lived experience. So I found that was very depressing and interesting at the same time.
Yeah. It's a very important point. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
What are your final words for robotics, for people who are maybe not in robotics but are interested in conversations about inclusion? What's the leading message you would like to tell everyone?
That's a big question. So whatever I'm going to say now, I'm going to regret at some point probably. But I think there are two things that I think are super important. One thing is to listen. So regardless of how good your intentions are, and I'm most of the time the intentions are good, myself included, by the way, you need to listen to what people tell you in terms of what they need. Don't assume anything, right? So you can assume that this is the right way to do this, but it's really not. That's the first thing, just listening to what people say, to their lived experiences, to their view of the world, especially when it has to do with their identity. So, I've been, people have tried to explain to me what it means to be a woman in STEM. And you know what? I don't need that to be explained to me because I know that. Or I know that from my perspective anyway. So that's number one. Number two, which I think is also something that people have to realize, is nobody's perfect. Mm-hmm. We are going to make mistakes. All of us make mistakes. And then when you make a mistake, see point one. You need to listen. I need to accept the fact that you're wrong, or that you didn't think about something in a certain way. And just, I find sometimes people get defensive, which is very counterproductive and kind of, doesn't help with anything. And, apologize, move on, right? Apologize, learn, and move on. So I'm definitely not perfect in anything that I do, well, period. But even in notion, in this context of inclusion and broadening participation and opening up, the environment, making sure that the climate is supportive and everything. Of course, I make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. The matter is what do you do later? Do you get defensive about it and annoyed, or do you it's uncomfortable being wrong. It's uncomfortable doing something wrong, and then listen and learn. So those are the main things, I think. And if everybody would be like that, I think our environment would be a lot more supportive.
Yeah. I think it's very interesting. So
much for talking with us today, Hadas.
At the end of podcast, I would like to thank you and Torrie for co-host for your time. Thanks so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Marwa.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, Torrie.
Thank you.